I'm Frank, and today we're anniversarying Chapter 37, The Stormy 60s, or if you're using the 15th edition or older, Chapter 38, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. As usual, Abe here will be starting us off.
All right, let's go. Congress strengthened the war on poverty and thus granted over $1 billion to develop the hills around the Appalachian Mountain Range. There were four main achievements of Johnson's Great Society program. 1. Providing aid to students, not schools, to allow funds to flow into churches. 2. Establishing Medicare for old people and Medicaid for poor people. Both programs did not require repeated congressional approval. 3. Reforming immigrant laws by abolishing the national origins quota and limiting the immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. Nonetheless, the main immigrant source shifted from Europe to Latin America and Asia. 4. A revised voting rights bill. Overall, Johnson's Great Society did cause the poverty rate to decline, but not by enough to please conservatives. Now, Frank, could you tell me more about the civil rights issues in the 60s?
Of course I can. Johnson turned his sights to the South, where Jim Crow discrimination made it hard for blacks to vote in free elections. Discrimination took form in poll taxes, literary tests, and plain old intimidation. Johnson oversaw the passage of the 24th Amendment, which ended poll taxes, or fees for voting. This move kicked off the Freedom Summer of 1964, in which African Americans and other reformers campaigned intensely for civil rights. Although there were successes, there were setbacks as well, as shown by the fate of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was denied its seats at the National Democratic Convention. Fortunately, the tide turned in favor of African Americans when Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which fought back against segregation across the South. Abe, can you tell me about Black Power?
Buckle up, this is a long one. After the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the peaceful protesting erupted into violent militant protesting, focusing on western and northern cities. For example, the Black Panther Party, an organization of black armed immigrants, emerged. Black leaders also became divided, beginning with Malcolm X, who supported black separatism and hated whites. Eventually, Malcolm had an about-face and began to support Islam instead of separatism. At the same time, Stokely Carmichael preached for Black Power, which had several facets. 1. Separatism. 2. Pride in African American heritage. And 3. Using violent means to defend civil rights. Racial problems moved north since many of the blacks had migrated. In the North, the Black Power movement emphasized economic problems such as unemployment rather than civil rights. Tragically, MLK was assassinated in Tennessee on April 4, 1968. His death sparked violence and riots worldwide. At the same time, voter registration in the South skyrocketed, and by 1972, more schools in the South were integrated or had both blacks and whites than in the North. So MLK's death had positive and negative impacts. Now, Frank, could you tell me more about the communist issue?
Of course. When the Dominican Republic revolted against its leaders, Johnson was quick to dispatch troops to quell the revolutionaries, since the revolutionaries supported communism, and America was afraid of having yet another communist satellite in addition to Cuba in its own backyard. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, Johnson intensified bombing against North Vietnamese targets and began to dispatch troops to the war zone. Abe, tell me, Vietnam.
All right. World opinion grew increasingly hostile to the Vietnam War, and Charles de Gaulle went so far as to withdraw France from NATO. The Six-Day War also occurred when Israel was attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, which were supported by the Soviets. Israel did expand into new territories, but a standoff between the Palestinians and Israelis was provoked after the war. Don't worry too much about the war. It's not part of American history. Thousands of people began to protest the Vietnam War as more and more young men were sent off.
Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Exactly. Senator Fulbright led the opposition to the war in Congress, and he exposed the fact that the government was deceiving the public about the war's causes and its winnability. The war also provoked violations to the Constitution, such as when Johnson ordered the CIA to spy on anti-war activists. Now, Frank, could you tell me about Vietnam's effects on Johnson's presidency?
Yes. Even as the American government claimed to be winning the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese unleashed a blistering offensive known as the Tet Offensive. America managed to fend off the insurgency, but not without taking heavy casualties. This led the government to call for 200,000 more troops, but public sentiment was increasingly shifting against the war. Finally, in 1968, Johnson stated that he would commit no more troops to Vietnam and begin rolling back bombing. He also stated he would not seek re-election in 1968. Well, Abe, now that we know that Johnson's not running in 1968, who is?
Well, good question. On the Democratic side, Humphrey and McCarthy battled for the presidential nomination. McCarthy's platform was anti-war, while Humphrey claimed that the war would continue until the Vietnamese proved that they were more willing to negotiate. Meanwhile, the Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who called for an anti-crime policy and victory in Vietnam. And George Wallace was nominated as a third party, and he called for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Overall, both the Democrats and Republicans wanted to continue the Vietnam War until an honorable peace, or American victory, was reached. Nixon won the election of 1968 as a minority president because of divisions over the war. Now, Frank, could you tell me how the acclaimed President Johnson perished?
When Johnson died in 1973, he left a complicated and mixed legacy. He had done more for civil rights than any other president in American history, but he had also sent thousands of Americans to their deaths in Vietnam. Abe, I've heard a lot about how the 60s were a decade of cultural upheaval. Could you explain more about that?
I would love to. A negative attitude toward authority was inaugurated in the 1960s, and many people lost their traditional morals. Protestantism also declined as church-going dropped from 48% to 41% by the early 70s. A new divide emerged as educated Americans became more secular, while the less educated grew more religious. Also in the tumultuous 60s was the free speech movement beginning at the University of California at Berkeley, in which students protested the ban on using campus space for political debate. Furthermore, many Americans began to use drugs, mainly LSD, and the word patriotism became a contemptible term. As if the 60s weren't eventful enough already, a sexual revolution occurred with the introduction of birth control. In the Stonewall Rebellion, gay men fought back after being attacked by several off-duty police officers. Lastly, the Students for Democratic Society were established and protested many of the core issues of the 60s, such as civil rights, war, and poverty. However, by the end of the 60s, the SDS transformed into a terrorist group called the Weathermen. Overall, the 60s were characterized with drugs, sex, and defiance to authority. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions about the 60s.
And we'll catch you guys next time.